Welcome to a world where the comfort of your own home can become the setting for your worst nightmares. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling true stories of neighborly terror that will make you question just how well you really know the people living next door. From unexplained noises in the dead of night to disturbing encounters with the unthinkable, these tales will leave you sleeping with one eye open. So lock your doors, draw the curtains, and get ready for 4 true neighbor horror stories. The first story is about the man in the mirror. It started with a simple, unassuming knock on the door. Lena had moved into her new apartment just a week ago. She loved the location. It was close to work, had a beautiful view of the city, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. It was perfect, almost too perfect. She was alone in the apartment when the knock came. It was late, around midnight. Lena hesitated for a moment, feeling a chill crawl down her spine. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Lena approached the door cautiously. She peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. She opened the door just a crack. The chain still latched. There was nothing but the empty hallway, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. Shaking her head, she closed the door, blaming her overactive imagination. But then, it happened again the next night. The same knock, the same time. This time, Lena didn't open the door. She waited, holding her breath until the knocking stopped. She was too creeped out to sleep that night. And when she finally did, her dreams were filled with unsettling images, dark shadows, distorted faces, and that knock endlessly echoing in her mind. On the 3rd night, the knocking was louder, almost desperate. Lena's heart raced as she approached the door. Her hand hovered over the knob, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. She backed away and sat on her couch, trying to calm her racing heart. That's when she heard it, a faint scratching sound, as if something was trying to claw its way through the door. Lena knew she needed help. She called her friend Jess, a firm believer in the supernatural. Jess arrived the next morning, armed with sage, holy water, and a skeptical boyfriend named Mark. They performed a cleansing ritual in the apartment, waving the sage in every corner and sprinkling the holy water. Lena felt a little silly, but also relieved. Maybe this would stop whatever was happening. For a few nights, everything was quiet. Lena started to relax, thinking that the worst was over. But then, one night, she woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't the knocking this time. It was a faint tapping, like something was hitting the glass. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and looked toward the window. There, in the reflection, she saw a figure standing behind her. Lena screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. She turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Trembling, she got up and checked every room, every closet, but the apartment was empty. The next day, she installed cameras in the apartment, hoping to catch whatever was haunting her on video. She also reached out to a paranormal investigator she found on Reddit, hoping they could provide some answers. The investigator, a man named Greg, arrived that evening. He was older, with a serious demeanor, and he didn't waste time with small talk. He set up his equipment, a few cameras, a digital recorder, and an EMF meter. Lena watched nervously as he moved through the apartment, murmuring to himself. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the mirrors?" he asked suddenly. Lena froze. "Yes," she whispered, her mind flashing back to the figure she'd seen. Greg nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "There's something about mirrors. They're like windows to another world. Sometimes, things can come through." That night, Lena barely slept, but nothing happened. The cameras didn't capture anything unusual, and Greg seemed disappointed as he packed up his equipment the next morning. "It doesn't always show up when you want it to," he said. "But be careful. If it's what I think it is, you're dealing with something very old and very dangerous." Lena didn't know what to think. Was this real, or was she just losing her mind? She decided to stay with Jess for a few days, just to clear her head, but it didn't help. The nights at Jess's were quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She felt a cold presence, always just out of sight, and she started seeing things in the mirrors again, faint, shadowy figures that disappeared when she looked directly at them. Desperate, Lena went back to her apartment. She needed to confront whatever it was, to prove to herself that it wasn't real. She sat in front of the mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection, waiting. Hours passed, and nothing happened. She was about to give up when she saw it, a dark shape moving in the mirror, coming closer. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The shape took form, becoming more distinct, more human. It was a man, his face twisted in a grotesque grin, his eyes black as coal. Lena was paralyzed with fear as the figure in the mirror raised a hand and pointed directly at her. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The man in the mirror leaned closer, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. And then, the mirror shattered. Lena screamed and stumbled backward, her heart racing. The mirror lay in pieces on the floor, but the figure was gone. She fled the apartment, not stopping until she was outside, gasping for air. She couldn't go back, not after that. Jess and Mark helped her move out the next day. They didn't ask questions. Sensing that Lena was too shaken to talk about it, she found a new place far from that apartment, a place without mirrors. But it didn't end there. Even in her new home, Lena felt like she was being watched. She covered all the mirrors, avoided reflective surfaces, but the feeling persisted, and sometimes, late at night, she could hear it, a faint knocking just outside her door. Lena never found out what haunted her in that apartment. Greg called her once, saying he'd looked into the building's history and found something disturbing, but she didn't want to know. She just wanted to forget, to move on, but some things you can't escape, no matter how far you run. Lena's story is a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some mirrors, once looked into, can never be forgotten. The second story is about the house on Oak Street. The house on Oak Street was infamous long before Emily and her family moved in. Neighbors whispered about its dark past, about the strange occurrences that seemed to plague anyone who dared to live there. But Emily's parents were practical people. They didn't believe in ghosts or curses. The house was a bargain, and that was all that mattered. It was a large, old Victorian with creaky floors and a sprawling backyard that Emily loved at first sight. She imagined hosting parties with friends, playing hide and seek in its many rooms, and making the place her own. But as soon as they moved in, something felt off. The air was heavy, thick with an unexplainable tension. It started small, a faint tapping noise that seemed to come from inside the walls, doors that wouldn't stay closed, lights flickering at odd moments. Emily's parents brushed it off as the quirks of an old house, but Emily wasn't so sure. One night, while unpacking in her room, Emily heard footsteps in the hallway. She assumed it was her mother, but when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, moving away from her, but there was no one there. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly closed the door, trying to shake off the unease. The next day, Emily's younger brother, Jamie, came to her in tears, saying he'd seen a man in his room the night before. Their parents dismissed it as a nightmare, but Jamie was adamant. He was real, Jamie insisted. He was standing by the window, just staring at me. Emily didn't know what to think. She wanted to believe it was just Jamie's imagination, but something about his story disturbed her. That night, she stayed up late, listening for any sign of the man Jamie had seen. But the house was silent, and eventually, she drifted off to sleep. The following weeks were filled with more unsettling occurrences. Objects moved on their own, strange shadows appeared in the corners of rooms, and the house always felt cold, no matter how high they turned up the heat. Jamie started to change too. He became withdrawn, spending hours alone in his room, talking to someone Emily couldn't see. One afternoon, Emily found Jamie in the backyard, digging a hole. When she asked him what he was doing, he looked up with vacant eyes and said, "The man told me to." Emily's blood ran cold. She grabbed Jamie by the arm and dragged him inside, but he struggled against her, screaming that he had to finish digging. It took all her strength to pull him away, and when she finally did, he collapsed in tears, shaking with fear. Emily knew she had to do something. She started researching the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. What she discovered was worse than she could have imagined. In the 1920s, the house had belonged to a man named Harold Garrison. He was a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors, and rumors swirled about his strange behavior. People said he was obsessed with the occult, performing rituals in the dead of night. Then, one day, he disappeared without a trace, leaving the house empty for decades. The few who had dared to move in after his disappearance didn't stay long. Each family left after just a few months, driven out by the same strange phenomena that now plagued Emily's family. Emily brought her findings to her parents, but they dismissed it as nonsense. "It's just an old house," her father said. "There's no such thing as ghosts." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She reached out to a paranormal investigator she found online, someone who specialized in haunted houses. The investigator, a woman named Sarah, agreed to come by the following weekend. When Sarah arrived, she immediately sensed the house's dark energy. She set up cameras and audio recorders in several rooms, including Jamie's. Emily stayed by her side, nervous but hopeful that Sarah would find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. As night fell, the house grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere became almost unbearable. Sarah began her investigation, moving through the house with a calm but focused demeanor. She stopped in Jamie's room, where the air felt thick and heavy, and pulled out a digital recorder. "Is there anyone here with us?" Sarah asked. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from the recorder, came a faint, whispering voice. "Leave." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Sarah replayed the recording, and the word was clear. Someone or something was telling them to leave. Sarah decided to conduct a spirit box session, a method of communication that uses radio frequencies to pick up spirit voices. Emily watched as Sarah asked more questions, the static of the spirit box filling the room. "Why are you here?" Sarah asked. "Trapped," came the distorted reply. "Who are you?" "Harold," the voice answered, sending a chill down Emily's spine. Sarah continued to ask questions, but the responses were jumbled and hard to understand. The session ended abruptly when the spirit box emitted a high-pitched screech and the lights in Jamie's room flickered wildly. Emily and Sarah both felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever was in the house was not just a restless spirit, it was something malevolent, something that had been there long before they moved in. That night, Emily barely slept, haunted by the voice of Harold Garrison. She was convinced that he was the man Jamie had seen, the one who had been giving him those terrifying commands. The next day, Sarah returned with another investigator, a man named Tom, who specialized in cleansing homes of dark entities. Tom performed a ritual throughout the house, burning sage and chanting prayers. The house seemed to react violently. Doors slammed, windows rattled, and a loud groaning noise echoed through the walls. But then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The house fell silent, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, things seemed to return to normal. The strange noises ceased, the cold spots disappeared, and Jamie seemed to be himself again. Emily's parents were relieved, though they still didn't fully believe in what had happened. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. She kept her distance from the mirrors in the house, remembering the strange, shadowy figures she had seen in them. And at night, she still heard faint whispers, just at the edge of her hearing. One evening, Emily decided to review the footage from the cameras Sarah had set up. Most of it was uneventful, just empty rooms and the occasional flickering light. But then she found something that made her blood run cold. In Jamie's room, in the middle of the night, the camera had captured something horrifying. A dark figure stood at the foot of Jamie's bed, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. It didn't move, just stood there, watching Jamie sleep. And then, slowly, it turned to face the camera. Emily gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. The figure in the video looked directly into the lens, and for a brief moment, its face seemed to change. It was Harold Garrison, his eyes burning with rage. The footage ended abruptly, the camera malfunctioning just as the figure began to move toward it. Emily felt sick to her stomach, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. She knew she had to get out of that house. She begged her parents to leave, to sell the place and never look back. It took some convincing, but after showing them the footage, they agreed. The family moved out the following week, leaving the house on Oak Street empty once again. Emily never told anyone else about what had happened there, not wanting to relive the horror, but she couldn't forget, no matter how hard she tried. Years later, when she saw an article about the house being sold to another family, her heart sank. She wanted to warn them, to tell them to stay away, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she just prayed that whatever was in that house had finally been laid to rest. But deep down, Emily knew the truth. Some things can never be truly forgotten. The house on Oak Street would always be haunted, its dark history waiting to ensnare the next unsuspecting family. The third story is about the stalker next door. It all started with the new neighbor. Grace had lived in her quiet suburban neighborhood for 5 years, enjoying the peace and the friendly atmosphere. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors would wave and chat in their yards. But that changed when the man moved in next door. He was in his late 30s, tall and lanky, with a permanent scowl on his face. From the moment he arrived, Grace felt uneasy. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up whenever she saw him. He rarely spoke to anyone, keeping to himself and coming and going at odd hours. At first, Grace tried to be friendly, waving when she saw him, and even introducing herself when they passed on the sidewalk. But he just stared at her, his eyes cold and unreadable, before walking away without a word. It left Grace feeling unsettled, but she brushed it off. Not everyone was friendly, she told herself. But then, strange things started happening. It began with little things. Items in her yard being moved, her mailbox knocked over, and strange noises at night. Grace dismissed them as pranks or accidents, though a nagging feeling in the back of her mind told her otherwise. She started to avoid her new neighbor, feeling a growing sense of dread whenever she saw him. One night, while Grace was home alone, she heard a noise outside her bedroom window. It was a soft tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the glass. Her heart raced as she lay still, straining to listen. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. Summoning her courage, she got out of bed and slowly approached the window, her hands trembling. But when she pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there, just the empty, dark yard. She stood there for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart, before closing the curtain and returning to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night, and she was haunted by nightmares of someone watching her through the window. The next morning, Grace found footprints outside her bedroom window, clear in the soft earth. They led around the side of the house and disappeared near the neighbor's property. Fear gripped her as she realized that someone had been standing there, watching her in the middle of the night. She immediately thought of her neighbor, but she had no proof. She called the police, but there was little they could do. The officer who came out took a report and advised her to install security cameras, but beyond that, there wasn't much they could do. Grace felt helpless, knowing that someone had been outside her home, but with no way to prove who it was. The next few nights were quiet, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She kept her blinds closed and locked every door and window, but the sense of unease only grew. She started seeing her neighbor more often, always lurking around his yard, watching her with that cold, dead stare. He never spoke, never waved, just watched. Grace tried to talk to some of her other neighbors, but no one had noticed anything unusual. Some had never even seen the man, as he rarely left his house during the day. She felt like she was losing her mind, becoming paranoid, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Then, one night, she was woken up by the sound of her doorbell ringing. It was just after midnight and her heart pounded as she got out of bed and cautiously approached the front door. She peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. The doorbell rang again, more urgently this time. Terrified, Grace grabbed her phone and called the police. As she waited for them to arrive, The doorbell continued to ring over and over until she thought she might scream. When the police finally arrived, the ringing stopped. The officers searched the property but found no one. They chalked it up to a prank, but Grace knew better. The next morning, she found something that made her blood run cold. A note had been slipped under her door during the night. It was written in shaky, scrawled handwriting and simply said, "I'm watching you." Grace was in full panic mode. She knew she had to do something, but she felt trapped, alone and terrified. She installed security cameras around her home, as the police had suggested, hoping to catch whoever was tormenting her. But the cameras only made things worse. The first night after the cameras were installed, Grace was woken up by a motion alert on her phone. She checked the feed and saw her neighbor standing in her yard, just staring up at her bedroom window. He was there for hours, not moving, just watching. The sight made her skin crawl, but when she showed the footage to the police, they said there was nothing they could do. He was on his property, they said. He hadn't done anything illegal, but Grace knew it was only a matter of time before he did. The following nights were a blur of terror. The man became bolder, coming closer to the house, knocking on windows, leaving disturbing notes under her door. The police continued to dismiss her concerns, and Grace felt more alone than ever. One night, she woke up to the sound of glass breaking. Her heart leapt into her throat as she realized that someone was in her house. She grabbed her phone and locked herself in the bathroom, dialing 911 with shaking hands. As she waited for the police, she could hear footsteps moving through her home, getting closer and closer. The sound of her bedroom door creaking open sent a wave of terror through her. She held her breath, trying not to make a sound, as the footsteps moved down the hall toward the bathroom. The door handle rattled, and Grace thought she might pass out from fear. But then, the sound of sirens filled the night, and the footsteps retreated. She stayed in the bathroom until the police arrived, too scared to move. When the officers searched the house, they found the back door broken and muddy footprints leading up to her bedroom. But there was no sign of the intruder. Grace was a wreck. She knew it had to be her neighbor, but without proof, the police couldn't do anything. They suggested she stay with a friend or family member for a while, but Grace didn't want to leave her home, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of driving her out. Desperate, she reached out to a private investigator, hoping they could find something the police couldn't. The investigator, a grizzled man named Ray, agreed to take the case. He set up more cameras, both inside and outside the house, and started watching the neighbor closely. For days, nothing happened. Grace began to think she might be safe, that the man had finally backed off, but Ray was convinced that it was just a matter of time before he struck again, and he was right. One night, as Grace was sitting in her living room, she heard a noise from the basement. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something was being dragged across the floor. Her blood ran cold as she realized that there was no way anyone should be in the basement. She had locked the door. She called Ray, who told her to stay put while he checked the basement. Grace waited, her heart pounding, as she listened to Ray move through the house. When he finally reached the basement, there was a long silence, followed by a string of curses. "Grace, you need to see this," Ray said, his voice tense. Grace reluctantly made her way to the basement, her legs shaking. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw what had caused Ray's reaction, a small hole in the wall, just big enough for someone to crawl through. It led into her neighbor's basement. "He's been coming into your house through this," Ray said, his face pale. "He's been inside your house this whole time." Grace felt sick. She couldn't believe it. The man next door had been invading her home, watching her, tormenting her, and she had no idea. She wanted to scream, to cry, but all she could do was stare at the hole in the wall. Ray immediately called the police, who finally took the situation seriously. They arrested the neighbor, who turned out to be a wanted criminal with a history of stalking and violence. You might just find yourself looking at your neighbors a little differently after this. These stories remind us that sometimes the real horror isn't in the haunted houses or the supernatural. It's in the everyday people living just a few steps away. If you've enjoyed tonight's tales, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chilling new story. And remember, you never truly know what goes on behind closed doors. Until next time, stay safe and sleep tight.